Welcome, everyone. So, I had a question come in that I'm going to answer as part of the seventh eye. And that is there a difference between darkness and evil? I see those terms used interchangeably quite a bit. So this is a big topic to cover. Ideally, I'd teach, like a 12-week course meeting once a week for 4 hours where we could go over all of the sort of theological constructs and conceptualizations of evil and darkness. But let's consider this a primer or sort of a kind of outline of understanding. Are evil and darkness the same thing? No. Um, but to really understand the term evil, from my perspective, it is helpful to understand it in two contexts. The first would be considered a smaller context, or basically a human context, or what we might call a moralistic context. And so, in this human context, we are made up of darkness and light. And often you are right, we consider darkness to be synonymous with evil. And so, I will say that there is darkness associated with evil. There is also evil that is associated with the light binary as well. So, I'm going to go over both of those, how they present and what they mean. So the evil that many of you may be more familiar with is the evil that is associated with the dark aspects of humanity. And so this is all of the stuff, a lot of it is fueled by trauma. That sort of thought of hurt people, um, is very true. I suppose a very different post to talk about how there are plenty of hurt people who don't hurt people out there, or that is not a valid excuse. But again, I will stop that digression. And so a lot of the evil that comes out of darkness is um, the evil that comes from people who have not dealt with their emotional issues, with their emotional traumas. They have stopped somewhere in kind of the terms of development. So basically, what that means, and the joke is kind of like, the person may be 40 years old, but they're really two toddlers wearing a trench coat because that is their reality. And as a result of this, they cause pain and suffering for other people, not out of any sort of real malevolence, but out of a sense of being in pain themselves. So that is one of the more like common everyday forms of evil associated with darkness. I will also say that there is an aspect of dark evil, so darkness associated with evil, that are people who do harm to others willingly and not really caring what sort of effect that they have. And so those people, we have all sorts of terms for them. The term sort of that is in fad these days is narcissistic. But we can really talk about how there is this form of selfishness that is within so many of us, that is within all of us, that causes for us to do dark things, for us to not regard others, or in some cases to kind of cross a boundary, cross a true moral boundary where we may cause deliberate harm to others out of that form of selfishness, out of that form of evil. And now let's get to an interesting one because ignorance is one of the largest forms of evil out there. But there is ignorance that is very much associated with the dark polarity, with darkness, and there is very much ignorance associated with the light aspects as well. And so the ignorance that is associated with evil and darkness is people who are knowingly doing things to harm others, as I've talked about, and not really caring, or caring and kind of doing them anyway. There's also an ignorance that comes with darkness where we are so stuck in our own trauma, in our own immaturity, in our own selfishness, that our ability to recognize others is severely restricted. And this is honestly where most people are. Um, I always use the example of 100 people being in a room. And one of the examples I would say is that if 100 people are in a room and you were to enter, it is likely that 97 of those wouldn't see you. And those 97 wouldn't see you because they are, they didn't notice you enter, which isn't especially evil, of course, but mostly those 97 wouldn't see you because of a few factors, because they are so caught up in getting through the day, getting through the moment, getting through their lifetime, that they are not going to notice anybody around them, really. Another thing that is very common in that 97 is that what people see in other people is simply their projections. And you can see this if you look at any comment thread of any video on YouTube or social media, or just chatting with friends or other people. Look at what they claim or what they notice about other people. What they are claiming in other people is a blind spot within themselves. And so they aren't really seeing the person entering that room. If somebody really embodies this awareness, really like lets it sink into their tissues, it is incredibly freeing because you recognize that other people don't really care about you. And that sounds rough in the moment because, of course, there are people that love and care about you and all that sort of stuff. But kind of people in the world as a whole, they're too sort of self-absorbed, too kind of into their own stuff, to sort of mired in their own darkness, their own pain, their own suffering, and what they're experiencing as reality is simply projections. And so that is a form of evil that is more of an everyday evil that is very associated with human darkness. It isn't the, psychopaths we see on, on our television shows, or what we hear on like kind of our murder podcasts, although that is certainly an aspect of darkness and evil as well. But it's more talking about here, I'm more talking about here this sort of what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, where people's ignorance, where people's suffering gets in the way of them seeing other people, acknowledging other people, really registering other people overall. If we go more into her definition of evil, kind of the banality of evil associated with darkness, I would say that that has actually more to do with the light, and specifically light ignorance. And I will get into that in a moment. Because I will mention one more thing about darkness, and evil, so evil that is associated with the dark polarity, which is that a lot of people are in a state of suffering that would simply be called dissatisfaction. And that is at the root of a lot of suffering. Dissatisfaction, self-hatred, self-loathing. And so if we consider this as a type of evil, we can consider what type of energy that person is putting out into the world. I've talked about this a bit lately, but is that person tearing everybody down? Do they just notice what is negative about the world and the other people? Are they easily manipulated into believing, into residing in a state of fear and hatred for anything outside of themselves? Um, all of that is a form of evil associated with darkness, and it is so common in all of us. We wish to consider evil to be what we see on TV shows about serial killers and psychopaths and that sort of stuff. And part of the reason why we like seeing that so much is because we're not really able to register it within ourselves. And so we look outwards towards it. But another reason is that if we consider that evil, we then do not register the sort of evil that is within us that is much more common and much more pervasive. And that is, what sort of energy do we put out into the world? Are we looking to build others up or tear them down? Are we dissatisfied with ourselves, dissatisfied with the world? If we are residing in those energies, that is a type of evil associated with darkness because we are creating a wave effect in which the energy that we put out into the world, our presence in the world, is creating more negativity and darkness. This is why shadow work is so powerful because we can take back all of those projections, all of that evil and darkness that we projected out onto other people, all of our dissatisfaction that we attempt to push out onto the world, onto others, our desire to annihilate, harm, all of that pushed out into movies and politicians and celebrities and all of that sort of stuff. We can take all of that stuff back. And what happens when we own all of that stuff within ourselves, even darkness and evil, is that our presence will shift. It will become much more realized and it will bring into the world waves of health, waves of healing, waves of awakening, waves of consciousness, waves of light, essentially. So let's talk about evil associated with the light because a lot of people don't think about this. I will say that the evil associated with the light often has to do with hypocrisy. It is somebody who is claiming to be a specific way, but then acting or their reality is quite a bit different. So they are essentially shielding themselves or putting themselves in a bubble of light. And what happens, as we all know, if we look out at our reality, is that the person saying, that's all for family values is going to be caught in an illicit affair. That's just one example. But it is a good one because we can understand what light-based evil within a human is like. And this is an evil based in ignorance. And often it is purposeful ignorance. I would say one of the greatest evils of our day is anti-intellectualism. And this has always been a trend. It's always been something that's been sort of woven through the fabric of our society. You can find Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov and plenty of other people bitching about it, in the 70s, or even, if you go back much further, Plotinus and other philosophers certainly talking about it as well. Um, but if we are talking about this type of ignorance, there is the dark type of ignorance where we are simply living out our pain and suffering because we don't know any better. We're just simply repeating patterns of trauma, basically. Then we have the light-based ignorance where we essentially hermetically seal ourselves in a bubble and we push out all of the darkness onto the other. And this is how huge divides within people and within groups happen. Because if we hermetically seal ourselves in that bubble, our darker nature can never be realized. And so what happens is that all of that darkness, all of that negativity, all of that evil will find somewhere to land on another person, on another group, on another event, something like that, so that there cannot be ownership of that. And so I would say that the ignorance that is associated with light is a very purposeful ignorance. Somebody often has the privilege to not have to consider the world and the people in it and suffering. They can again put that bubble around themselves and just be sort of self-concerned, self-focused, only focus on themselves and perhaps people who think and believe and look exactly like them. And so this is an ignorance that we very much should talk about because it very much is an aspect of the light, is this purposeful ignorance, is this bubble. As many of you know, obviously, who are watching this, is that I've studied and, listened to many accounts of spiritual awakening and gone through my own. And there is this interesting divide in which some people who are kind of that light-based energy are using light as a sort of shield, believe that spiritual awakening is just about that, what is ever in their immediate sphere. And you'll see this language in some of the books and material on spiritual awakening because people who operate in this way, they never talk about being of service to others. They never talk about acknowledging other people unless it's a very self-serving way. Like, look at me. I noticed this person that was inferior to me is, the same stuff that I am. Aren't I great? Sort of thing. And so beyond that sort of self-serving sort of bubble, there isn't any talk about, being of service, of having a calling to, of to humanity, of like having that ripple effect out into the world of positivity. And you can see this sort of light-based, narcissism. Yes, I'm going to show that word in a lot of spiritual materials. First, I think because, of course, we need to focus on ourselves first in order to heal, because that creates space and energy and time to consider other people. But if the end goal of the spiritual awakening is incredibly self-serving, it would be more in that kind of bubble, not paying attention to the rest of reality, which is not only a moral failing, but it also could be described as evil. And so we go back to Hannah Arendt's thought about the banality of evil. And the evil associated with light often has to do with passivity. It is the thought that this does not directly concern me, and so I do not need to take action regarding it. I don't need to think about it. I do not need to be consciously aware of it. I'll talk about something that came up for me this week, which is that I've had a couple people come my way talking about the dark feminine, which is a topic that I love, of course. But they were talking about it in a way in which it was clear that they were interested in the dark feminine, the polarity of, being conscious of feelings in the body and that sort of stuff. But they had no awareness of feminine rage. They had no awareness of, kind of the misogyny or sort of system-based oppression of women that is a part of our society, a part of our world. And that is a part of the dark feminine as well. And so if we go towards the banality of evil definition, in a light way, that light form of evil is that technically all of us are evil. Fun thought. I probably lost most of you by this point. Maybe I haven't, but because all of us are part of systems, all of us are part of humanity, and so all of us are engaged in some level of oppression, harm of other humans, of other species, of the earth itself, of the universe itself. Simply our being here, our living here, in some level creates harm. This creates a huge existential crisis for people who become aware of it. Typically, it's wrapped around needs for personal healing, but people can awaken to the point where they really get a sense of their energy flowing outwards to the world and recognize that some of it is inherently destructive. Some of it is inherently locked into systems of oppression, systems that do harm to other people, that do harm to the world, to the universe, to animals, all of that sort of stuff. And that's a difficult thing to awaken to. And so when we're talking about the banality of evil, we can talk about things like stupidity, people who are clueless, that sort of stuff, because that's kind of the continuum of light as well. We can sort of think about the bumbling idiot. For example, taking us a bit back, there's probably better media representations of this these days, but I think of Woody Harrelson's character in Cheers. That was very much a light-based evil because his ignorance, his stupidity, his way of being very much created waves that were not, ones of deep wisdom, deep learning, concern, for those around him, sort of thing. And so, for a little bit of a recap, I would say that the light aspect and humanity of evil is almost always somebody that can sort of insert themselves in a bubble that is self-serving, that has the capacity to not care or be passive because they have inserted themselves into that bubble. There is little care or concern for other people. There is that sort of self-cherishing, that concern only for the self and how the self is represented in the world. And that too is a form of evil that is not associated with darkness. It very much is associated with light. I'll talk about one more form of light evil, and this is one that I come across quite a bit, talking about things like spiritual awakening and consciousness and that sort of stuff, which is arrogance. Arrogance is very much a light form of evil. And if we were to talk about dark versus light in terms of this, in terms of arrogance, I will say that people on the spiritual path kind of hit two roadblocks. The person who is kind of stuck in their darkness and trauma um, will tend to have imposter syndrome. They will get to a point of spiritual awakening where they envision Jesus or a priest or a prophet or something like that and be like, that is not me. I am nothing. I am nobody. I am not special. And that is their resistance point, is going into that place of really understanding that they have a divine spark within them, that they are special. They are to be cherished and loved and deserve to be ultimately divinely loved, unconditionally loved, and regarded. For people kind of stuck in the light and that form of, evil and how it presents every day is people who believe that they are much, much further on the spiritual path than they actually are. And this, again, comes out of ignorance most often, but it also comes out of this sort of self-cherishing notion. It comes from the thought, the rigidity of, I am very special, I need to be very special, a desire for fame, a desire to be seen as special. Um, and in some people, there is a difficulty in, thinking about themselves as anything other than enlightened or extremely profound or wise or, all of that sort of stuff that can come from arrogance and, entitlement associated with the light. And for those people, it is quite difficult to bring themselves down to earth, so to speak, to recognize that, hey, there are a lot of profound thinkers out there. On the scale of things, you might not be one of them. I read Camus or somebody like that, and I am blown away. I read Nabokov, and I'm like, I will never be able to structure a sentence like he does. And so those are just examples that come to mind. But um, I will say that for those individuals, the ego is a tricky thing to navigate, and that somebody willing to consider that they might not be at the end of their path, but more of the middle or the beginning, and willing to see the end of the path as infinity, as a vast expanse in which we can only inhabit a corner. This idea of cosmic insignificance, all of this sort of stuff. Basically, those individuals need some humility, as well as a real reckoning with the thought that, hey, maybe I'm not as enlightened or wise or whatever um, profound as I think that I am, sort of thing, coming down to being ordinary, so to speak. Uh, and so that is a very common form of light-based evil, is people who are putting themselves out there in a way that we might call overconfident or entitled, but specifically the type of arrogance that does not match does not necessarily match reality. So that covers most of, a good chunk of the spectrum of human, evil, the dark and light polarities within. In shamanism and animistic thought, we also have this conceptualization of evil that does not have to do with humans. I mean, it does in a way, I'll get to that in a moment, but it is considered one of the sort of primordial forces that composes our universe. One of the ways that this is expressed and can be thought of is sort of like a virus. Not in, never mind. And we can consider that energies associated with evil can present as either dark or light. For example, energies may present to somebody as the lightest of the light, and actually be quite dark, or energies that may seem a bit dark may just need some compassion and healing, that sort of thing. But if we go to really explore evil in kind of this larger sense, there are two ways that we can consider this. The first would be considered or a part of darkness. Um, and so this would be earth-based energies and energies that we might associate with varying sins, greed, gluttony, colonization. There are so many, mastery, all of those, arrogance, all of those things I talked about. We can consider those evils to be a part of what we might call, the larger force of evil, and that evil can come and infect us. And so we can, from a shamanic perspective, become infected with an evil of hatred, an evil of greed, an evil of desiring mastery over something, an evil of dehumanizing others, all of these sorts of things, an evil of gluttony. And so this is not to take personal responsibility away from the very human element. Sometimes people do that. If you really look at some of the old literature, for example, on possession, what you will find is young women, most often, and sometimes men, being like, oh yeah, I made a deal with the devil, and that's why I wanted to have sex with this boy, because they were in puritanical culture, and so blaming it on the devil rather than being like, hey, I'm a 14-year-old and want to have sex with this boy. That would not have been allowed structurally, which is, again, another form of evil, is the systemic oppression. Um, that is expressed and experienced through all of us. And so if we consider evil to be something that can be experienced sort of like a virus like this, I find that's the best conceptualization of things because we can then sort of animistically understand how somebody may become under the influence of greed, for example, or sloth, or whatever the sort of concept is that considering them as living beings that can infect is a helpful way to think about things. However, from a shamanic perspective as well, is that where there is a recognition of outer forces of evil, and yes, they are associated with darkness, or many of them are, um, and is that um, there is a human element to them as well. If the energy, if the evil of rage kind of attaches to somebody, infects somebody, it is most often because that person has an opening in their system and has unhealed rage within themselves. And so there are all these people out there that do all these sort of entity removals and all this sort of stuff, and people who go through ayahuasca purges and all this sort of stuff where they come into contact with all these sorts of entities or purge all these sort of entities, um, and they come back, and the reason that they come back is because they're just viewing them as outer things rather than understanding from an inner perspective of what personal work needed to be done so that like wasn't attached to like, so to speak. So let's work our way up the chain a little bit. Some of the scariest experiences I've had, some of the most profound experiences I've had of evil have been very land-based. And so you can look at my video on Godzilla because it perfectly talks about how dark forces are created. But if we are talking about the type of energy that comes from, for example, you know, nuclear bombs, World War II creating Godzilla, that is the perfect example. But we can also consider places where people have been murdered, where there has been abuse, poorhouses, insane asylums, places where there was a lot of slavery, indentured servitude, where people were treated incredibly poorly, where there was a lot of bloodshed, where people were buried without recognition, mass graves, stuff like that. That is going to create as well as draw in what we would consider to be evil. And so events like that not only are often very human events, like a war or something like that, but we also consider, from a shamanic perspective, that evil was created out of that event. Darkness, heavy energy was associated with that event, as well as if there is kind of darkness, evil nearby, it will kind of be like, ooh, like, let me go and feed. Because that is essentially what darkness, what evil is looking to do in kind of the larger sense, is to find appropriate places and candidates to sort of feed on, so to speak. And the best way out of this is through personal healing. But if we're talking about land-based events, a lot of people don't believe me because they have not had experience of evil. There have been places that I have gone that, especially kind of, not to pick on New Mexico, but I lived in the New Mexico, Arizona area for a while, and there are places that I would go to where I would just go there and turn right around with a thought of, nope, this place is not for me. And so I have told people that it would be better off if they would sell their house or something like that, because if you have something truly evil that is land-based, it isn't like the movies. It isn't where you can, just, say a little prayer or something. It is a complex matter, and it's almost always better to leave. Just my personal opinion, doing this work for a long period of time. Other people I've had a number of people over the years who start doing this work with the best of intentions, and then they figure out either that it is real or that evil exists, and they can't just philosophize it away. And then they get really incredibly freaked out and afraid, and they don't know where to turn because they all thought that you know, that truly everything was inside the body, inside the head, that there weren't anything sort of things called spirits, even if they call themselves, shamans or ghost hunters or, whatever their title is, spiritual worker. But even if somebody is aware of spirits, being aware of the true capacity of evil is another thing entirely. And unfortunately, I hear about it every day in a very human capacity, the sort of things, the brutality, the unfortunateness that we can visit upon each other, especially upon children, is unfortunate, to put it gently. But let's work our way outward. If we are talking about this larger sense, most often, yes, darkness and evil are a bit synonymous. However, that is there is plenty of darkness that has to do with death, that has to do with the ancestors, that has to do with energies that are more earthbound, that are very much not evil. They just have a denser energy. And so we run this risk by talking about evil and calling it synonymous with darkness, either within ourselves moralistically we're outside of ourselves as a larger force, of not understanding that there are plenty of dark things that are beautiful, special, wonderful, earth-based. All of our joy, our sexuality, our bliss, all of those experiences that people have, dancing, singing, tasting good things, those are all associated with the earth and with darker energies. And so I get people who very much want to transcend, and they get to this place of emptiness where they feel disconnected from everything. And I always think, like, that's not a very good way to spend your life. Of course, that's me being judgmental a little bit, but our human lives are very much meant to be lived. And that is a part of being part of the earth, part of the body, part of kind of a denser vibration of things. People who come to me and are saying, why am I not feeling bliss? Or why am I feeling so distant and numb from myself in my spiritual path, even though I'm so far in it? And the answer is that they're going outside of their bodies. They aren't awakening within their bodies. That is where we find all of the good stuff, which is associated with darkness. But let's take it out to the last part of talking about this, about evil as a force that is a part of our reality. And so we can consider evil as a force that is part of one of the primary building blocks of our reality. Just as there are, we can consider it the battle between evil and good, kind of darkness and light on a grand scale. But really, if we go to these very primordial building blocks, what do we consider the force of evil? The force of evil is anything that is not love. And this doesn't mean love and light. This means love, love in a body-based way, love dark, love light, love beyond good and bad, dark and light, evil and good. Whatever is not love can be considered evil. It is the absence of love. I will say that I will share that I've gotten to a point of perspective. Oftentimes I, very much can sink into it more than others, where I recognize that the harm that people do, that, what I'm talking about, like, the negativity or the harm or even robbing a convenience store, all that sort of stuff comes from the fact that they do not experience love as a bodily act. They haven't been loved properly. So I realize that sounds cheesy. So I'll bring us back to one more facet of darkness. Um, Actually, before I do that, let me take us out even wider, and then I'll end with one more facet of darkness and evil within the human form. Um, and that facet is that when you really start working with some of these huge, larger energies we might consider forces, elements, gods, goddesses, what happens when you work with them is that you recognize their massive nature and that their nature goes way beyond the understanding of light and dark. In fact, they are light, dark, everything in between. And so what this means is that the first work that I did really interacting with doing ritual magic with angelic energies is that I recognize that an energy would appear and it would appear to be sort of an underworld dark energy, and then it would appear to be a light energy, and I would recognize that they would be the same thing. And so truly, if we were going out to that largest aspect, we are also talking about energies and beings and all sorts of things that populate this universe that go way beyond our conceptualizations and polarities and that inhabit every single layer from dark to gray to light and from celestial to the deepest ranges of the underworld and deepest places in the underworld. They are all of that at once. And that is a lot to fathom, and most people can't. So they break it up into little chunks so they can perceive things and conceptualize things because we enjoy doing that. So, last thing I'll mention is in my work, there is always a question of the matter of soul. So, somebody who is deeply in contact with their soul has, you know, their heart open, there's a shine to their eyes. They tend to be creative in whatever way they are expressing themselves in this world. They're in touch with their feelings. Feelings are very much a gateway to the soul and are a very dark thing. Um, Even the feelings of joy, bliss, happiness, those are all dark things, even though we think they're light. How we get to them is through feeling our darkest emotions. But if we were to go into like considering matters of soul, somebody can either be truly in contact with their soul, with that divine essence within themselves, know themselves as kind of that divine being or manifestation of the divine, or see themselves as consciousness and totally part of the cosmos, completely unified, whatever your deal or conceptualization is. But there can also be most people are not in that place. Most people are in a place where their soul has been sort of caged up, where they've lost soul, where they've lost personal power, they've lost soul. And so they go into this world, feeling depleted, feeling unengaged. Their eyes do not shine. They may suffer from things like depression and devitalization, you know, just kind of going through the routines of life like a robot instead of truly inhabiting their days, so to speak. And so then we go all the way down the scale. And I will say that most people who are living, who are here, have a soul. It has just been damaged or diminished due to abuse, trauma, systemic oppression, all of these sorts of things, ancestral past life stuff, all of these sorts of things. So it is only like sort of a faint glimmer within them rather than a bright spark, so to speak. Um, and so that scenario is very different than the small percentage of humans walking around who we might consider soulless. So I've had some people come to me, and I've had the experience myself of somebody who truly their eyes change into that flicker of black. And in neurological terms, they try to explain this by people saying that those people are engaging their reptilian brain. And people typically engage this brain, their eyes go black right before they're going to do something horrible, some sort of abuse or real harm to other people, that sort of thing. So that's the neurological perspective, is that we have this as humans, we have like a three brains stacked on top of one another. And our midbrain is the limbic brain, and our base brain back here is the tail of our brain, so to speak, is the what's considered the reptilian brain, or that very much associates us with our very primitive instincts, the reptilian brain, where the eyes can truly change, sort of like a reptile's does. But in shamanic terms, there are people walking through this earth that do not have a soul. Most people do. And so I realize that some people may argue with me with this, and it's likely because they have um, luckily not been at a point to meet somebody like this. Mostly what we meet on our path, I would say 99.7% of humans are just damaged or diminished souls. We've experienced a lot of suffering, and so our souls have been clouded, damaged, diminished, all of that sort of stuff. But there are some people walking around that are truly empty within, where there is a distinct hollowness and complete absence of soul. And I just thought I'd add this because if we are talking about truly evil acts, like if you watch shows about psychopaths and stuff like that, is that there may be that glimmer of a soul, but for some people, they simply have the meat suit, but nothing soul related within. And so I hope that this answers your question. Probably gave you more than you need to think about, but um, is evil synonymous with darkness? No. Is a great deal of evil associated with darkness? Of course. Is there evil associated with light? Yes, of course. Are there ultimately concepts that go beyond dark and light? Yes. What is, in the truest sense, evil? It is the absence of love. Anywhere we can find that absence of love, we will find evil.